So here we're going to go through some of the big heart murmurs and things to remember. Aortic stenosis, crescendo, decrescendo. For those not musically inclined, the idea is that the sound gets larger and then it gets smaller. Now on the exam, and even on practice tests, people have moved away from actually saying crescendo, decrescendo, murmur. The reason is everyone knows crescendo, decrescendo is aortic stenosis. And so what's more than likely going to happen is that you're going to have to hear a you're going to have to place the stethoscope, you're going to have to listen, and you're going to have to actually hear this, getting loud, getting soft. On the off chance that you don't get that, what you will get is something that says radiates to the carotids, or they'll have you place the stethoscope on the exam at the carotids, and there you'll be able to hear it. It is pathognomonic for aortic stenosis. I think I have yet to see a question where it talks about radiating to the carotids and it's not aortic stenosis. Now here's the big thing. Aortic stenosis, you see it all the time as a reason for syncope in older patients. So if you've got someone 65 years old, keeps on running, keeps passing out, and then they ask you to take a listen to them, you're going to want to check those carotids. Okay. All right. Mitral and tricuspid regurgitation. So just like how in aortic stenosis, radiating to the carotids, in mitral regurgitation, it's going to radiate towards the axilla. Okay. And one of the cool things about, it doesn't really matter. This is a hollow systolic murmur. What that means is just that it happens throughout the entirety of systole. They're not going to say things like blowing murmurs. You're just going to have to listen to it and say, oh, that's going throughout, all of systole. You listen and at the apex and you'll say, well, it's got to be mitral regurgitation, right? Okay. So here's the next thing that we were talking about on the previous page up here. All right, talking about how the chordae tendineae, more relaxed, increased left ventricular volume. Well, that all kind of plays a role here. And the big thing is going to be this mid-systolic click. Mitral valve prolapse. Okay. And again, remember how the difference between mitral valve prolapse and mitral regurgitation. Mitral regurgitation, you can just have, a bad valve. It just talks about the regurgitation of blood going backwards. And that's usually because of a bad valve. When you're talking about mitral valve prolapse, you're talking about the valve. You're talking about the valve literally going back because of the chordae tendineae. It has to do with poor chordae tendineae and having, sufficient strain on them. Ventricular septal defect. You'll never miss it. Loudest at the tricuspid area, hollow systolic also. Here's kind of an interesting point that you'll get quizzed on. What they might have you do is listen to two different people and say who has the larger, septal defect, or they'll say something like, over time this person's ventricular septal defect, was harder to auscultate, and you'll have to say, is the VSD gone? Has it gotten worse? Has it gotten better? And a lot like anything, right? When you've got to throw or move a bunch of stuff through a tiny orifice, it's gonna create a high intensity murmur. Whereas if you have a much larger orifice, you gotta move stuff, you're not really gonna hear any sound, because it's not really rubbing up against anything. So for that reason, which is what's highlighted here, larger VSDs have a lower intensity murmur than smaller ventricular septal defects. Okay. So, and And by the way, these are all systolic murmurs. But you already knew that. All right, good job. Next, diastolic murmurs. Aortic regurgitation. All right, so aortic regurgitation has to be my favorite murmur. And the reason is the physiology behind it. Mitral stenosis is also pretty cool, but we'll get to that later. So, big thing, diastolic decrescendo. Now, personally, I have a hard time hearing this decrescendo. It's diastolic, so that kind of limits out some of the other ones. But what's really going to give it away is the description of everything. They're going to say they took his blood pressure 160 over 60, and you're going to go, holy shit, 160 over 60, what's going on here? And what's going on is you have this hyperdynamic pulse, a widened pulse pressure. And so if we really quickly kind of delve deep into why you have this widened pulse pressure, why would you have a systole of 160 and a diastole of whatever it is? I said 60. Well, the reason really has to do with what, systole and diastole are, systole and diastole are. So if we think about the left ventricle, and we'll just have the left ventricle right here. And we have the, got your diastole valve right here, fantastic. And here you have the aorta kind of coming off of it. So, obviously systole, however you want to pronounce it, doesn't matter. It's the pressure in your arteries when the heart squeezes, and diastole or diastole is the pressure in your arteries when the heart's relaxing. Okay. But you can also think of it, and it's really essentially the same as the pressure in the aorta during systole or diastole, for systolic and diastolic. And so when we start thinking about the pressure in the aorta, all right, I'm going to explain to you right now why you have a very high number for systole in aortic regurgitation and a very low number for systole in aortic regurgitation. And the reason has to do 100% with the regurgitation. So let's kind of do this again. Let's assume we have a normal heart, and we'll say that this is the left ventricle and it's completely normal. We got a little valve right here. And that here we have the aorta and it's completely normal. Okay? In a normal world, blood gets pumped out here, and then it keeps going. All right, goes to the rest of the body. Okay. However, during aortic regurgitation, what ends up happening is that, just as you know, the blood gets pumped through the valve into the aorta, but then it kind of goes back, all right? Because you have a shitty valve, essentially. You have a bunch of retrograde flow that's going back right here. So what ends up happening is that you have an expansion of the volume inside the left ventricle. And so each time that the left ventricle now has to send out blood during systole, every time the left ventricle contracts, well, it's got a whole bunch more blood now that it's got to push out. It's got all this stuff now. And so what that is going to lead to is, well, when you have more stuff inside of an area, more blood inside of a compartment, you have an increase in that pressure. And so when the left ventricle, now when the left ventricle, which now has all this blood that it's trying to pump into the aorta, it's pumping all this stuff here into this relatively smaller space, in big quotes, because this is not to scale. So now it's got all this stuff it's got to pump here So you're going to have an increase in the pressure in the aorta during systole because you've got all this blood right here. Because remember, you have all the regurgitation from what should have been pumped out that's now back in the ventricle. So you got more stuff in this ventricle. I'm really just repeating myself over and over again just to make sure that everyone's on the same page. During systole, typically things just go this way. However, because of regurgitation, I don't know, we'll say half of it, or however much, comes back into the left ventricle, making it larger, giving it more volume. So now the next time that it pumps, it's got all that extra volume it has to pump out, all that extra volume, all that extra pressure. So that's why you have a higher systolic pressure. But what about the diastolic pressure? Well, remember, the diastolic pressure is, again, the pressure in the arteries, or the pressure in the aorta when the heart's relaxing. But if you remember what's happening when the heart's relaxing, you have all this blood that's flowing back into the ventricle, to the left ventricle. And because pressure is just made by things pushing against the wall of the aorta, well, if you have less blood, because it's all getting thrown back into the left ventricle, if you have less blood pushing against the wall of the aorta when everything's relaxing, because again, it's all going to the left ventricle, when you have less blood in the aorta during diastole, you have a decrease in pressure. And that's why you have a wide pulse pressure. Well, way cool. And yeah, the head bobbing's a real thing. Every time your heart kind of beats, you'll see people do that. Now, you probably won't see it all that often. I've seen it once, but this guy had pretty severe aortic regurgitation. And unless you're really in a cardiology clinic, or unless you're really looking for it, you probably won't see it, on the floors that often. You probably won't see it too often outpatient. But yeah. And so then mitral stenosis. So here we go. Follows an opening snap. People love talking about this opening snap. And yeah, as you know, it's due to the stopping of the leaflet motion in diastole. Okay, makes sense. Okay, during filling of the left ventricle. Okay. So what it's basically getting at here is, here we'll say this is the left ventricle, and here you've got your valve, right? So if you have a normal valve, right, let's say that a normal valve will open up, instead of being closed like this, it'll just open up nicely, 90 degrees, we'll say. And it'll let all the blood from the atrium kind of just go in. Not a problem. However, if you have stenosis, what'll happen is that it won't open up as much, It'll just open up, instead of it open up 90 degrees, it opens up, 30 degrees. Well, if it doesn't open up as much, that means it doesn't take as long for it to open up. And for that reason, you have a quicker onset of the snap. So, greater the stenosis, the quicker the onset of the snap. Okay. And then finally, PDA, continuous machine-like murmur. You won't miss it, trust me. What's going to happen is they're going to play you a sound, and it's just going to sound constant. And you're going to, wonder, like, what the hell is this? Is this real? And then you're just going to realize, oh, I'm hearing this thing throughout systole, throughout diastole, the entire time. Oh, it's got to be patent ductus arteriosus. And obviously, if they're talking about rubella or something, then it's kind of a gimme, but, whatever.